Hello and welcome in to the Fog.net podcast. My name is Michael Swain, the Kansas beat writer for 24/7 Sports, joined like I am every Sunday night during the football season, or I should say Sunday. We're doing a Sunday night podcast this week, but Kevin Flaherty joins me, and we're going to talk about a team that lost a game with its backup quarterback. Defense played all right in spurts. Offense was inconsistent. And, of course, I'm talking about the 49ers. That's what we're here to talk about today. No, I'm joking. We're here to talk about Kansas. After a 35-23 loss to Baylor on the road. Let's make this a quick one. Let's dive right in here, Kevin. Where do you want to start with this? Do you want to go offense, defense? We can even throw special teams. There's special teams to talk about. Where should we start tonight?
I feel like I want to start with a general thing and almost go chronological, just
Okay.
because I
Yeah.
think that we talked last week and after the TCU game about Lance Leipold's comments, right? Or I guess 2 weeks ago, and how he said basically after that game, people were like, "Oh, game day was here, great atmosphere." You lose your starting quarterback, your backup quarterback goes in. You guys were so close.
Hmm.
And he didn't say, "Yeah, man, like that was awesome, like we were right there." What he said was, our margin for error is thin,
Hmm.
and we need to be a certain something in order for the University of Kansas to win a football game and win a football game against a good opponent. And you can't have these little things go wrong at this point. And he goes, "It's not right or wrong. It's the state of where the program is right now. They're
Hmm.
still learning how to win, obviously still developing talent, still hoping to get better in a lot of ways." But I really thought that as much as you came out of that TCU game and said, "Man, Jalen doesn't fumble the ball on the goal line. If you hit the little flare out pass to Devin Neal on second down, if this, that, and the other would have gone differently, you won that game." I think Lance Leipold was probably having a little bit of deja vu, right,
Hmm.
against Baylor, where he looks at the start to that game and the end of that game. And you can't really talk about this on Twitter because it's so few characters, there's no nuance.
Yeah,
But I
exactly.
think that you can be both simultaneously proud of the fight that your team showed. They didn't give up. They fought back into the game. They closed it to 5. And I think you can also say, well, we closed it to 5. We didn't get the stop when we needed to at the end, but more importantly than that, sleptwalked kind of through a half, and you're not going to beat a good team. And you and I have talked about this off air. I think Baylor has a chance to be a pretty good team this year. When you watch them, they aren't far off.
Mm-mm.
And so I think that when you saw Baylor having the success that they did and some of the things that they did, it was easy to look at it and say, okay, Baylor is starting to find its footing. Really nice response from Kansas, but again, like Leipold said against TCU, no margin for error, and Kansas cut its own margin for error away. What did you think?
Yeah, I agree, and it's something I think I've talked about in the post game wrap video after the Oklahoma game, and you know, basically, I feel like I keep repeating myself each week because it's the same issue each week, right? It's kind of those fine margins. And
Yeah,
when you're Kansas, you can't sleepwalk through a full half. And again, like you can spin it. And that's the thing about, I think this team right now is you can really spin this however you want. If you want to get down in the dumps, you can. And sure, if you want to. But I could also spin this and say, well, look at that. KU didn't play a half of football. They just let Baylor play football for a half, and KU just decided not to play. And then in the second half, they were able to make it a game. And I think you
yeah,
can take that and spin that as a positive too. But I think you're right. Like you look at just the overall margin, Kansas is not at a point with its backup quarterback, with the team banged up overall. You can't have halves like that and still expect to win the game. And I think it's obviously a credit to the offense that they turned it on in the second half. But I just think overall, I think you're right. I think you look at the game, the start, just diabolical, honestly. Like from the start, it was diabolical, right? You go 3 and out, a 14-yard punt into the wind. In the wind, like, sure, the broadcast kept hitting it home all game, like the wind, the wind, the wind, even after the sideline reporter came on and said, hey, the wind's kind of died down here. But
yeah,
you have that. then you have a fumble on the next drive, and you're basically setting Baylor up with short fields. And again, what has this team done all season? It's been explosive on offense for the most part, and then really force the opposing team to take the long road, go 65 yards, go 75 yards, right? You have to execute. And by giving them short fields, I mean, you're basically handing Baylor the ball and saying, all right, now go score. Because KU's defense, just over the course of a drive, finds a way to get in those plays where, okay, third and long, and you can get a stop, where when you give them a short field, it's just asking them to go and score. And so I think from the get-go, I guess we could probably start defensively in the first half, at least. Like, I think for me, when I look at it, the short field is such a huge thing because, again, it puts so much pressure on the defense to, from the get-go, get a stop. And you look at Baylor's offensive line, man, those guys are physical and they are big. And I think that from my perspective, right, I think I've talked a lot about how KU substituted and how they've tried to really widen the margin on the defensive line by keeping those guys fresh and making sure those guys play a couple snaps and come out, couple snaps and come out. They just got outmatched, and it didn't even matter how rested those guys were. The Baylor offensive line was bigger, stronger, more physical, and I think that really set the tone. And in the first half, I think it really just limited what KU could do, because we've heard it a lot from Brian Borland saying, okay, if you get to third and short, really hard to call plays as a defensive coordinator. You've heard Andy Koldenecki say when you get to third and short, it's really easy to call plays. Well, Baylor barely got to third down anyway. And that's something that they've done all season, right? They entered the game with the least amount of third downs in the Big 12. And I think for KU, it just started with the run defense, and it was an issue all game. But I think for me, you look at the team early in the season, right? They stopped the run pretty well. Teams were getting about, 4 yards a carry around there. And then, it just kind of compounded to where you give up, back-to-back weeks now of almost 300 yards in consecutive games. So I think for me, when I look at the defensive performance in the first half, and obviously it goes through the whole game, but I think specifically in the first half, just defense, it's like, man, couldn't stop the run. And then there were just those back-breaking third down plays where KU just could not get off the field on third down, right? Baylor converts 2 third and longs, and you're just looking at it and saying those were the plays that if KU's going to get back in the game and get the score before the end of the half, or make those, again, we talk about winning plays, those plays, man, those third downs are so crucial. So I think for me, you look at that first half defensively, a lot went wrong. Obviously, I think the defense wasn't great in the first half, but I'll tell you what, the offense did them no favors in terms of playing kind of that complementary football that Lance Leipold talks about a lot.
Well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the punt too, because Kansas's defense forced 3 turnovers, and you look at that and you say, "Gosh, our defense forces 3 turnovers. You should win that game probably, or at least have a really good shot at it." But Kansas's offense turned the ball over twice. I mean, one, you can argue, I'm still not sure about that Quentin Skinner
The
call.
second one,
Yeah. But at the same time, there's 2 there. And let's be honest, a 14-yard punt is a turnover. It is. I mean, it's a turnover in terms of you don't flip the field on that punt, and you're giving the ball away in an advantageous, position. And so really, if you count that punt, it's 3 turnovers to 3, and Kansas didn't get the advantage from those turnovers that you would have expected. I think the point on third down is a really salient one, and I think it's one that you have to look at moving forward with Kansas having 4 games left. If you're going to get to a bowl, if you're going to find that extra win somewhere, you have to find a way to get off the field on third and long. And I don't know if that's something where they say, hey, we were in position to get off and this guy didn't execute, and so that's what happened here. I don't know if it's something where you look at it and say, Blake Shapen was awfully comfortable back there on third and long. Maybe we need to dial up some things to try and send some guys at future quarterbacks, or what the solution is. But when you get into that spot, and let's be real here, one, you want to get off the field in those spots. But the other thing is, it's really debilitating to a defense to get somebody behind the chains like that, where you can almost taste them getting off the field, and then they convert. And, looking at who Kansas has left on the schedule, Kansas State will go for it on fourth down if it's relatively close. Texas Tech went for it on fourth down, 8 times against Texas? I mean, and so when you look at that stuff, at that point, when you get them into third and long, you don't just need to execute to not give them the first down. You need to hold them to a spot where they can't really consider going for it on fourth down either. And so I think that was a really big and maybe undersold part of this is if Kansas was able to, even with the short fields, even with the issues they were having, if the defense could have gotten off the field on those third and longs, this is probably a different game. And it's a different game. I think we've been sort of harping on all this stuff. One of the things I do want to say is this is a very smart staff, and we've seen this over the course of the season. They made adjustments, and I thought that as easy as it is to say, well, Baylor let up or whatever else, I thought Kansas was able to find some success both offensively and do some things defensively to kind of take away some of the things that were maybe hurting them early on.
Yeah.
The issue is you just and we have this running joke this season, right? The game doesn't even start until you're 14 points down. That eliminates so much margin when you go out and you're down 14 points, down 24 points. In this case, you're down 25 points at 28-3. And so when you have all of that, it really puts you behind the eight ball in a way that you shouldn't be. And when you look at the way the defense played in the second half, Baylor scored 1 touchdown in the second half, and it was on the most important drive that the defense faced. But at the same time, if you executed in the first half, if you had done the things that you were supposed to do, and I'm not just saying defensively, I'm saying offensively, you add another touchdown in there in the first half, you execute it at certain points, you don't turn the ball over, maybe you don't absolutely have to have that one stop in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at the third down numbers and even fourth down, right? So Baylor in the first half goes 6 of 9 on third down, 2 for 2 on fourth down.
Yep.
Second half, right, it flips where all of a sudden they go 2 for 7 on third down and 1 for 2 on fourth down, right? And that one fourth down stop was pretty big, right? It ends up sparking one of those touchdown drives. But for me, when I look at the offensive performance in the first half, right, any game plan you had is out the window.
Yeah.
Right? It's out the window. It doesn't matter anymore. And what does KU want to do? They want to run the ball, control the clock, shorten the game, right? You want to look at the pace of play. KU's the slowest team in the Big 12, and it's close with K-State, right? There are a few plays per minute, a few percentage points faster. But KU's the slowest team offensively in the Big 12, the 109th slowest offense nationally out of the 131 FBS teams. This is a team that wants to control the ball, run it, and then on defense, control the ball by using those substitutions. And when all of a sudden you have to start throwing the ball, it puts so much pressure on the offense and your backup quarterback and Jason Bean to go out there and make plays. And it was another game where early on, I just felt like something was missing with the offense. Obviously, the run game couldn't get going. They finished at 56 yards for the whole game. But even Jason Bean was completing about 50% of his passes, I want to say, in the first half. And it's just not great. So I think for me, when I look at it, early on, you're just so behind the eight ball that it puts so much pressure on Jason Bean to go out and make big-time plays. And Jason Bean's a good quarterback, and I still am of the belief that if he has to play more this season, he will put KU in a position to win games. But you need to play complementary football with your backup quarterback, and they just weren't able to do that. And I think you look at the offensive line, I think for a lot of the season, they've been good. They've been really good, especially protecting the quarterback. They've got very few sacks, the fewest in the Big 12. But against this Baylor defensive front, there just wasn't any push up front. And guys like Devin Neal just couldn't get anything going. And then all of a sudden, when there's no run game, you're relying on those wide receivers to go make plays, and KU was without Luke Grimm on Saturday. And so all of a sudden you're seeing Douglas Emillion play a lot more. Obviously, Trevor Wilson was out there a lot more. So again, this is one of those things where just everything really compounded for KU in the first half. And I mean, man, you want to look at the first half numbers. I mean, man, 76 yards in the first half total. In the end, the 56 rushing yards is the fewest they've had under Lance Leipold, period. They had more than that in every game last year. Just a really poor offensive game from KU. And I think for me in the first half, it just comes down to when they needed big plays, they really just couldn't do it against that Baylor defense. And I think for me, when you look at the second half, things really changed when Baylor kind of went a little softer coverage. Lance Leipold kind of said it post game. I don't know if he meant to say it, but he said that Baylor went soft and they were able to take advantage of that. So I think for me, I probably pin this overall result performance more on the offense than the defense, because I think you look in the second half with the defense, they were able to get stops. Once they stopped giving Baylor the ball inside their own territory, KU's defense was okay. And they got stops when they needed to, for the most part, outside of the one that they actually had to get later in the game. So I think for me, I just look at it holistically, and KU needs to play complementary football, and they just weren't able to. And again, it goes back to the start. You need to start better in these games. And how many times is it now, right? You fall back 14-0 against Houston, against West Virginia. You fall 2 possessions behind against TCU. Now you do it again here. You just look at it, and it's like, man, the team's not good enough to overcome that consistently. They were early in the season because they had a Heisman quarterback, right, as their leader and the guy that was leading the team. Now you don't have that. You have a quarterback that is decent, right, for Power 5.
Sure.
Decent, right? Big drop off, though, compared to where they were early in the season and the ability to overcome that.
Yeah, and I think, here's, the bolded takeaway, I guess. Kansas has to run the ball. Kansas cannot be successful in a big game like this without being able to run the ball. And it's not even necessarily about Kansas has to run the ball because that's what it does best or whatever else. A lot of it's about tempo. A lot of it is about, like you said, playing complementary football. It's about taking some of the weight off your quarterback. It's about taking some of the weight off your defense. And even beyond that, if you just want to get into a broad description of it, Michael, if you're playing one-on-one against Michael Jordan and the score is 1-2, you've got a chance. I'm not saying it's a great chance, but like you could rise up and hit a single jump shot and win that game, right? You could rise up and hit a shot and win that game. If it's to 25, you've got no chance because he is significantly better. It's more possessions. Even if you luck out and hit like 5 shots, you're still losing by a lot. And so that's the model when you have a less talented team, when you have a less good team, and that's a harsh way to put it, but it is what it is. And it's basically the way that Bill Snyder coached football. And I know that, there are a lot of people who are probably like, man, why would you bring Bill Snyder up here? I always joke around that Bill Snyder won more games in college football than any other coach where the other team walked off the field feeling like they were the better team. Oh, man, we would have beaten, K-State today except for A, B, or C. K-State wins 17-13. And he slowed the tempo. He made sure there were fewer possessions. They ran the balls. A lot of times it was ugly. And you said, hey, man, like, I can't believe they won this 12-7 game or whatever. And I'm not saying this Kansas team is typically going to win 12-7 games. What I am saying is running the ball is not just running the ball to get 5 yards on first down. It's not necessarily running the ball for different reasons. One of the things that it does is you're trying to kind of chip away and shorten the game. You're trying to make it to where your quarterback faces 3rd and 3 rather than 3rd and 8. And so all of those things sort of factor in. And so when you're looking at Kansas against a team like Baylor, it was really tough for Kansas to block Siaki Ika up front. And he's had a really good year, the nose tackle for Baylor. But at the same time, I think that when you look at the recipe for success, because I did see some Twitter comments and things like that where people were saying, why didn't we just throw the ball like that all game? And I think, you made a fair point, and Lance Leipold made a fair point that Baylor was probably playing a little bit softer coverage after they had the lead. But I think even beyond that, Kansas probably, and this isn't a knock on Jason Bean, Kansas probably isn't going to win a game where Jason Bean puts the ball up 55 times. And so if you're going to win that game, even if you're not running the ball effectively, it's not like it's something you can take and just throw away. That's part of how you win. That's how you fight your battles. And so I think that the running game, while it didn't, while it wasn't successful, and you and I, one more quick thing on that, we talk a lot about how much Kansas misses Jalen Daniels, and Kansas does miss Jalen Daniels in multiple ways, one of which being, I think, his leadership. Even I think they got a charge out of the emotion that it shows. People don't talk enough about how much Kansas misses Daniel Highshaw and his ability to make yards after contact. I think Devin Neal is a really good back. He's kind of slithery. He's got more home run speed than Highshaw does. But Highshaw is the guy that you can give him a carry. You don't block it necessarily the greatest. He puts his pads into the chest of a linebacker, and he gets you 3 or 4 yards, and you chip away and learn to fight it, live to fight another play. And so I do think that that's maybe an absence that maybe doesn't get discussed as much as it should.
Yep. And I thought Lance Leipold actually had a really good comment about it post-game, where you go back to the first 4 weeks of the season when KU was playing probably, compared to now, the better football. Who are the guys making plays? Jalen Daniels, Daniel Highshaw, Kenny Logan to some degree, definitely Lonnie Phelps.
Yep.
What do all those guys have in common? They've all been banged up. And you go to someone like Lonnie Phelps, and
don't forget Kobe Bryant. I mean, makes the play against West Virginia,
exactly that too. So that brings me to this, where this team needs a bye week so badly. This bye week, obviously Lance Leipold talked about it, where it's like, okay, do you want the bye week in week 2 or now? Obviously, you take it now. You probably wish the bye week was this specific weekend, not this next weekend.
Sure.
But here's a rundown of some of the injuries to starters, right? Kobe Bryant misses the game with the lower leg injury. Kenny Logan and Lonnie Phelps have been banged up since week 2. Talon Berryhill played the game with a club on his arm, and that hand has been bugging him for a few weeks now. All right, cool. Let's go to offense, right? Daniels misses the game. Daniel Highshaw, probably not going to play again this season. Luke Grimm, out for this game. Michael Ford, your starting guard, missed a good chunk of that second half, right? And Armaje Reed-Adams had to come in for him, right? That's you're approaching, you're getting somewhere close to about 10 starters, guys that play a lot and are good players being out. That is huge for a team that, again, we talk about the depth that Kansas has at positions, but when that depth wears down, like running back, for example, well, all of a sudden, Devin Neal, they're still wanting to manage that workload, but the drop-off from Highshaw to someone like, I didn't even mention Kai Thomas. Kai Thomas has been banged up too and really hasn't looked like he's found his footing so far this year.
Even while it's not an injury, Trevor Wilson is just getting back into the swing of things as well. Yeah. And so it's a lot.
It is. And overall, right, you talk about the depth, right? Okay, you feel better about that, but it doesn't change the fact that those are really good players that you're missing. Yeah. And so, we'll see about Jalen Daniels, right? Back in practice a little bit this week, warmed up ahead of the game. I think if he doesn't play against Oklahoma State, I think I'd be a little bit surprised, honestly. Yeah. I think this is trending towards that direction. Same thing with Kobe Bryant. I think he'll be back. I think this is a team that once they come out of the bye week, I think they'll look closer to what you saw in the first 4 weeks of the season than what you saw the last 4 weeks, which even going back to that Duke game, I mean, you remember how many times guys were leaving the field in that Duke game, right? That game was physical. And Lance Leipold came out the next Monday and said, yeah, guys are not feeling as good as they felt at the start of the season. And from there, it's kind of slowly kind of built and compounded as you play more and more. And you're playing physical teams. Baylor is physical. Oklahoma is physical. You look at Iowa State, that defense is
Yeah,
physical, right? So overall, you're playing such physical teams, and it's starting to wear on you. So I think the bye week is going to be huge for this team. Big picture for you, Kevin. Go and look at Saturday. I feel like we've been kind of negative, which I get, right? Bad performance, and it's totally right to criticize, be negative. I think giving credit to the team for the fight that they showed is
sure.
something that, for me at least, is huge. Years past against Baylor, they fold, right? 16
Yeah,
or 23 points is the most they've scored against Baylor since 2011, I think is what I put out there.
yeah,
And it's the closest margin of defeat for Kansas against Baylor since 2011 as well. This is a game that KU gets smoked in every year for the last decade. And this year they had really 30 minutes where they were uncompetitive and then 30 minutes where they were pretty good. So if you want to look at progress through that lens, cool. Power to you. I lean that way. I'm more on the optimism side of, hey, you're showing fight, right? See preseason expectations. What did I talk about? Be competitive in games. Make it a game in the fourth quarter. Well, that was a game in the fourth quarter.
yeah.
So for me, I think those are some of the positives. I have some more, but I'm curious for you, like, what do you think are positives from this game?
Yeah, I think one of the other things too is you talked about all the guys that they need to get back, and I hear that, and that happens to a lot of teams
Of
at this
course.
point of year. It kind of cracked me up. I was transcribing Jeff Halfley from Boston College, and somebody asked him. They said your bye week come at a good time for you, with you guys being so banged up. And he says, I wish it came a week earlier. And I felt like that was
Mm.
Kansas, right? And but the other thing is I think you saw some guys kind of getting pushed onto the field in interesting situations. What a play by Jeremy Robinson.
Mm.
I mean, that was a terrific play. You saw Craig Young have a great play in coverage at one point. Lorenzo McCaskill, made a nice play or two in run support. You're asking these guys to make plays who weren't always out there. Quentin Skinner's getting better by the week, and I know that he had, the turnovers at the start. Great catch. When was the last time that you can remember? Because Kansas has had some solid wideouts,
Mhm.
with Steven Sims and different guys. But when was the last time you could remember Kansas having 6'2", 6'3" guy that could outrun defensive backs down the field and get open like that? And so I think there are a lot of individual things that you look at, heading into yesterday's game. I thought Mike Nowitzki was maybe having an all Big 12 type season. I think he's having a really good year. And so I think one of the things that gets lost in the Leipold um, in the Leipold comments about margin of error that
Mm.
we talk about quite a bit is we aren't talking about that if Kansas wasn't close. And I think that that's the main positive that I take out of this is it's not Lance Leipold sitting up there when Kansas loses 45-10 and he's saying, well, our guys have to realize you can't false start, you can't do this, and you can't do that. And when you when somebody makes a mistake on a football field, let's just say a wide receiver drops a pass, there are different ways that you can address it, right? Some coaches are going to go totally hard ass and they're going to curse that guy until the sun goes down and tell him he's terrible, right? There's the coach who's going to say, okay, that's fine. You'll get him next time and go the other way. But there's a really valuable, I think, middle road in there where you say to the guy, we can't have you dropping that pass. You're better than that.
Mhm.
And where you're both talking them up and saying, look, you're a good football player. That wasn't a good football play. You need to make that play. And I think that's where Lance Leipold is at, right? I think he's walking kind of that middle of the road where he's not excusing it. He's not saying, oh, that was okay for you to fumble. Oh, that was okay for you to be out of position on third and long. He's also not going out there and just dog cussing them and saying you're terrible, you should never play at Kansas, whatever. What he's doing is saying we can win this football game. And the fact that he can say that, it is a tremendous step forward from where
Mm-hmm.
Kansas said. But he's saying, in order to win this football game, you have to be the football player that we know you are and that we know you can be. We know you can execute this,
Mm-hmm.
so execute it. And I think that's a positive for me looking forward is taking that away is the fact that Kansas isn't far off, and Kansas is in sort of the spot where Leipold can criticize and say, "Hey, guys, we've got to clean this up. We've got to be better." But he can do it from the lens of, and if we do, we win this football game. And I think as Kansas big picture goes into its final 4 games, it does give you some encouragement that, hey, that Kansas team from the second half is there. And if
Mm-hmm.
Kansas cleans up the first half, Kansas is going bowling this season.
Yeah, and I think it's that. It's you clean up small bits. This isn't you need a ton of new players, or you need,
Yeah.
you need a grocery shopping list of things to happen. This is you need 3 or 4 things to go differently, and you can win ball games. And I
Yeah.
think that is where the progress is being made, and where the team has already shown progress. Right? They haven't gotten blown out yet this year. Right? And I think that's a part of it. Where at the end of the game, you look at the final score, and you can look at the numbers, right? You want to go by yards per play, that's pretty even, right? Baylor just ran more plays because KU could not sustain drives, right? You go to Oklahoma, you give up so many yards, right? And yet your offense is still able to kind of keep you in the game a little bit, even if when the game mattered most, right, in the middle of the first half, they weren't there. Cool, you're still pointing at one section of the game where you need improvement to be able to win. And I think that for me is huge progress. I think you mentioned the individuals. That for me is when I look at a game like this and say, wow, this is cool that you're seeing guys come out there and show that they can play. Let's use Marvin Grant for an example. And
Sure.
I'll talk about some other guys. He shows up in the summer. That's tough, right? His first time playing with his team was in fall camp. And as the season has gone along, I thought early on in the season, it just looked slow, looked a step slow with bad angles, missed some tackles. And then all of a sudden, yesterday, when Baylor's run the ball a bunch, right, it's not great that they're getting to the third level of the defense before they see a guy. But Marvin Grant, I don't think he missed a single tackle, right? And he ends up with 11, and 7 of them are solo, right? That's positive because you look at his eligibility going forward, he has multiple years left. So you've got right there a boundary safety that you can trust, that has experience, that can make big plays for you. And you're learning that, okay, he can hang against a physical team like Baylor. You look at 2 young guys we talked about before, right? Tommy Dunn and DJ Withers.
Sure.
They're playing 10 snaps, 10, 15 snaps a game. And on Saturday against Baylor, I thought Tommy Dunn, there was no drop off between him and someone like Caleb Sampson. It's just little bits of experience and knowing how to do certain things and handle yourself. But the fact that he went out there and did not get manhandled or pancaked is a huge development, right? He's
Yep.
a redshirt freshman that just went out and played against one of the top 3 physical offensive lines in the Big 12. I think that's fair
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah.
And didn't get his butt kicked. That is positive. So I think while
Davion Westmoreland getting up.
him too. That's a good point. Yeah, right. JUCO transfer who's going to redshirt this year, but still comes out there.
And he came in late too. And I think that's one of the things when you have so many additions, it's so easy to look at it and say, well, Marvin Grant is really good. He's going to play right away. Lorenzo McCaskill's really good. He's going to play right away. And there's a learning curve. You're learning a new system. You're going to a new school. Your football complex is in a different place than your football complex was before. Your meals are in different places. Your classes are in different buildings. I don't think people realize with these college football kids how big of an adjustment it is when you do switch schools like that. And for these guys who came in late, like McCaskill, like Grant coming in and like you said, playing his first ball in the fall, like Davion Westmoreland, who was a late addition. The fact that these guys are out on the field, they're having solid moments and everything against some better Big 12 teams, that doesn't just bode well for this year, Michael. Like, that's how you build your program.
Exactly. And you think about it, right? These are young guys that are coming in, right? You're going to lose a lot of defensive tackles, right? Caleb Sampson is having a great year. So is Eddie Wilson. You're going to lose both those guys. Well, you've got guys coming through the pipeline now that you feel good about, right? Wide receiver, you're going to return a lot of guys, right? You look at running back, you return a lot of guys. And that's what makes this whole thing about building, right? Building a program, building depth. I think from my perspective, it's why winning one more game this season is so important for Kansas to almost hit, I don't want to say fast forward because I think we've already kind of hit fast forward on it, right?
Yeah.
But those practices in
Yeah.
December, when you can work on getting those young guys more snaps, right? You can build that offensive line depth that Lance Leipold talked a lot about during the preseason of saying we need more of that. You can work on building that and getting those guys more reps on the field, right? Even if some of your super seniors are leaving, they're leaving. Guess what? You just stole yourself, 15 practices, something like that?
Yeah. It's an extra spring. It's an extra spring practice.
Yeah. You just
like an extra full spring. And typically, I mean, coaches vary, but typically, and guessing this is the way Kansas would handle it if they went bowling, you use about half of those practices not to prepare for the bowl, but for your young guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got guys who are not going to start your bowl game. They're working with the ones and they're going out there and they're getting repetitions and chances to develop and things like that. And so that's why those practices are really so valuable.
Yep, exactly. And so for me, I look at this and obviously the performance itself on Saturday was not great, right? A lot to improve. But for me, who's somewhat of an eternal optimist, right?
Sure.
I think you find some of those moments where you're like, okay, this is still headed in the right direction. A bad result, a 3-game losing streak does not change the fact that this is a successful season. Even if people's expectations change, even my own expectations changed, right? I'm still of the opinion that Kansas will win one more game this year. But it doesn't change the fact that they've won 5 games. They've had their best season since 2009. And basically, they will return just about everybody on the 2D for the most part, right? Outside of a couple spots and maybe some guys transfer. But I think you can go take this tape from this year and show some of the guys that have been really good, like Lonnie Phelps. You can go show some stud defensive ends if you want to go get a defensive end. I don't know if they will or not, but you can go show that to guys and say, hey, look, we had Lonnie Phelps come in the spring and play well. Like, look at this. So I think for me, it's one of those Saturday, not a great day overall, but it's one of those performances where you can pluck some of the positives right out of it and say, looking ahead, things are still going in the right direction. But I think you can also acknowledge that, hey, that was not good. And I think Lance Leipold and the coaches have said it. And I'm sure they'll say it on Monday when we talk to Leipold again that, hey, that was not good enough. But for me, I just think that, hey, sometimes you got to flush games. And if you want to pick progress parts, right, it's Baylor. So any other thoughts?
Yeah. So we do a question segment usually at the end of this. And so I want to go ahead and ask you a question.
Oh, gosh.
No, it's not bad. We've talked on this show repeatedly about how Kansas has not put together a full 60 minutes yet. They haven't put together an effort where you would look at it and say that's peak Kansas right there. They came out, they conquered all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
Where's your optimism level with 4 games left that we see Kansas put together at least a full 45, 50, if not all together 60 minutes in one of those 4 games?
Where's my optimism? That's a really good question. I'm pretty optimistic. I still think that this bye week is going to be so huge for that, right?
Yeah.
You talk about playing a full game. What does that entail? I think that getting guys fresh where they can execute is a big part of that. I think getting your star quarterback back on the field and playing is a big part of that. So I think that we will see a more complete game. I don't know if Katie's going to play a full perfect 60 minutes. I think that's probably a little bit unrealistic at this point.
That's what every coach wants, right? Every coach chases.
Yeah. And there's going to be mistakes. Guys are going to make mistakes. That's just going to happen. But I think you look at the remaining games, and I think KU can play a really good game, a really good 50-minute game, and still lose.
Yeah.
You could play Texas.
And it might happen against Oklahoma State.
Exactly.
Oklahoma State's a good football team, and it could be that Kansas comes out and when I say a perfect 60 minutes, I'm not talking, put up 600 yards of offense, hold the other team to 200, win by 80 billion points. What I'm saying is be crisp and complete. Don't beat yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we haven't seen all the way through, right? If Kansas can avoid turnovers, if it can execute defensively to where guys are in the right spots, they're playing cleanly, and I mean, and even then, sometimes you're going to give up plays, right? Like even if guys live out their assignments, occasionally the other guy is just going to be better than you. He's going to go up and he's going to make a catch, or he's going to outrun your guy in space, or whatever else. But I think when I look at answering my own question, I guess I'm also optimistic. I think when you look at things like the way Kansas played at times against Oklahoma, at the way Kansas played at times against TCU, for a lot of the TCU game, to be frank.
Mhm.
If you look at the way that Kansas played at times against Baylor, I do think in one of these Final Four games, we're going to have a game where you and I sit here and win or lose. We're just like, Kansas played well. They did what they could. They left it out there, and maybe that results in a win, and maybe it's a loss. But where we look at it and say Kansas did what it could.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think you look at it, it's not did Kansas play perfectly in all three phases. Can you leave the game and say Kansas played well in all three phases?
Yeah,
And they haven't really done that yet against a Power 5 FBS opponent yet. And yeah, I do think it will happen. So I think that'll do it for us. I think we've got enough of the negativity early on, and then probably a little too much optimism maybe at the end. I don't know. You be the judge of that. But thank you always for listening to the Fog.net podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and make sure if you're also watching on YouTube, you head over to the podcast platforms and subscribe. So if you can't access the YouTube video, right, you're driving, you're commuting, you can listen to the podcast version of the show. It's the same name. The Fog, a Kansas Athletic podcast. And so thank you as always for listening. We'll probably have a midweek basketball podcast because we're getting close to basketball season. And then we'll be back next Sunday to talk about the bye week and look ahead to Oklahoma State. Thank you as always, Kevin, for joining, and we will talk to you all in just a few days.